Christian Post. It's Jeannie here, and today I have the privilege and the honor of speaking to someone that I highly esteem. I feel like he's a voice for this generation, one that's needed, that's knowledgeable, and as we shared right before we jumped on, he's a shepherd, and this nation needs to hear from a shepherd. Pastor A.R. Bernard, Senior Pastor of CCC, the Christian Cultural Center in my hometown, Brooklyn, New York. Pastor A.R. Bernard, thank you so much for chatting with us.
It is my pleasure. And I think that what you want to do here is so important because we need to have a conversation and keep that conversation going. Because unfortunately, our nation has not allowed for that conversation. But we have something very important happening here today in America that we've never seen in this country.
Yes. And you know what? What an opportunity we have as the church to actually inform and to share knowledge and wisdom. And the temperature outside is crazy. People in my generation have, I think, really felt like the need to spearhead a movement for change and to do something different. But I wanted to hear from you specifically because as the body of Christ, as the church, I'm also seeing a lot of things. I'm seeing multiple things. People that are like marching, people that are quiet, people that are speaking and saying all the wrong things. So I thought it would be awesome to hear from you, to share some terms, specific terms that we've been hearing in this climate during social unrest and just injustice in our nation, and even the cry to hear the church sing a different tune than the world is singing. So I don't know if you want to say something before we jump into the terms, or if you just want to jump right in.
Well, no, we'll have a conversation. Let's flow.
All right. So the term Black Lives Matter.
Mm-hmm.
I have found that it has been very polarizing, specifically for some people in the church. Can you kind of speak to what comes to your heart and mind and spirit when it comes to that?
I'm careful when we have terminology and we say that it's polarizing. If I say white privilege, that's polarizing because there are white people who don't want to hear that.
Agreed, yeah.
Most recently we had a pastor try to change the language and it kind of backfired on him. So when we say Black Lives Matters, are we talking about an organization? Are we talking about a movement fueled by a philosophy that's pushing back against racial injustice in this country? It depends on what we're talking about here.
And as a church, do you think, because there is an organization and they do have their own beliefs, and as many people love to point out to me, their beliefs are not in line with what they believe about in Jesus and all that. As Christians, do we make sure that we stay clear of saying a term that's an organization term and saying something that might be just a little bit more direct to what we want to portray for justice?
Well, now you're forcing me to be subjective.
Oh, I'm sorry.
and I have to be because Black Lives Matter, in terms of an organization, is not even to be understood as an organization like the Congress of Racial Equality, the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the days of Dr. King. Black Lives Matter and its founders sought to push back against one particular entity. So when they met with the mayor of New York City after the Eric Garner chokehold incident, there were 15 different leaders, 15 different organizations or entities under the umbrella of Black Lives Matters that met with the mayor. So for those who think of it in terms of one organization, one corporation, you're not understanding it. Black Lives Matter is a movement that is pushing back against the deficiencies and inequities socially in our systems and structures here in the United States, especially as it relates to Black and brown people. So if you understand it as a philosophy, as a movement to address certain issues, then you can embrace it. Because I don't agree, if you go to their website and you look at what their beliefs are, I don't go along with those beliefs. Those beliefs are antithetic to some of the beliefs that I have as an individual, politically, socially, and even in my Christian identity. However, I don't have to subscribe fully to the beliefs and values of an organization in order to appreciate what they're doing in a specific area. And BLM is doing something very important in the specific area of issues of racism, implicit bias, structural evil, institutionalized racism in our nation.
Yeah.
So without subscribing to them fully, I can subscribe to this one specific area that I think it's important and needs all of our support.
Thank you so much for saying that. And I'm asking you too, like, we need to know, I feel like we're in such a sensitive time, everything is very politically correct or politically incorrect. And then when you're from Brooklyn, it's like, I feel like everything goes out the window because you're just trying to keep it real. But I do think that the church needs to have a proper understanding of what it is. And, you mentioned the word white supremacy, which is another word that I had.
White privilege, yeah.
Oh, white privilege, yes. But I wanted to talk about white supremacy, actually, one of the terms. But even white privilege, as you did say, I've learned that people get really upset when you say white privilege and imply that they might have a bias of white privilege. I myself, I'm a Latina from New York, but I realize that my skin color gives me certain privileges. I don't have to fear for my life or my husband's life the minute I walk out of my door because of, fear that I'd get stopped by someone or someone would be afraid of me because of their lack of understanding of the Black person in this country. Can you talk a little bit about, and I don't know if that ties into white supremacy or not, but I've learned, and this could be wrong, so please educate me. I've learned that there's a lot of conditioning that's happened, and white supremacy can be behind it. I'm not sure. What do you think about when you hear the word white supremacy, and when it comes to the church, even in particularly the Western church?
I make a distinction between white superiority and that philosophy and white supremacy. Because when I think of white supremacy, I think of those who are convinced, not just in white superiority, but in white domination of the world. And, that's a different animal right there. So when we look at where we are in this world and the whole issue of whiteness and blackness and brownness, all right, racism is a human social construct. And as we know it and see it playing out today, it goes back to 600 years of European imperialism. Africans were racialized. I mean, it goes back to England not being able to subjugate a labor force from the Irish who fought back. Once that failed, they had to look for a cheap labor force elsewhere. They ended up in Africa. That resulted in colonization, not only by England, but also by the Portuguese, by the Italians, by the French, by the Spanish. All right, so we had Europe and Europeans now looking for labor, all right? And they had to create some type of a class system because essentially racism is a tool used to reinforce classism. So in America, when it was established here, it was not like the forefathers said, well, we hate Black people, let's let's subjugate them in the New World. No, slavery was an economic system. that was established here in America. And the racialization of Africans was necessary in order to create a class system that had the white power elite on top, and then even early on, indentured white servants who could work it off. And then on the lower rung were African slaves. So we have to understand it as a social construct to enforce classism.
How has that impacted the church? And how can we do away with something like this?
Well, it impacted the church because the New World was here, America was founded by primarily Calvinists, by primarily white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And when they established this nation, all right, they did not have Black people in mind in their Constitution or in their Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was written by Thomas Jefferson in one night in Philadelphia. He wrote it overnight, presented it to the others who looked at it, critiqued it, and agreed upon it with some minor changes. But when Jefferson wrote these words, all right, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, all right, that he was not thinking about Black and brown individuals. He was not thinking about African slaves. He was not thinking about Indians. He was thinking about the British government. And he was stating that they, white persons in the colonies, had the same privilege, right, dignity, and worth and value as human beings as the British, who were oppressing them. So he did not have Black and brown people in mind. Far from that truth. So if anyone tries to say that, it's not true. I will say that it was providential, that God had a hand in it, because
Absolutely.
those same words, we as Black and brown people in America can hold America to those stated, clearly stated values in their own Declaration of Independence. So we have to understand the history of it. And there are those who want to not look at the history and move forward, say, well, can't we just start from here and build in the future? But look, if you don't understand yesterday, you'll be confused about today. And you will repeat the past tomorrow. The prophet Jeremiah in chapter 6, verse 14 said, he said, you cannot heal a wound by saying it's not there. And denialism is an attempt to avoid an uncomfortable truth. It's like whites rejecting the whole idea of white privilege. The reality is that you may not have participated in the enslavement of Africans. You may not hold to the same philosophy of the myth of Black inferiority and white superiority. However, you are a beneficiary of that history. And as a beneficiary of that history, you have privilege. And there's all kind of privilege. There's economic privilege, there's status privilege, there is a privilege that comes when you hold a particular position in life. So there are many privileges, but specifically white privilege, you may not like it. And I don't believe that we should change the language to make you more comfortable in the conversation.
Yeah.
Persons of color have been uncomfortable for 400 years in this nation.
Yeah.
And the frustration that is being expressed now comes out of that 400 years history of being uncomfortable in a nation that we call our own, that Black soldiers went and fought for in World War II, and yet were rejected coming back to this nation. And the GI Bill that was supposed to help veterans was designed to enforce Jim Crow and segregation. All right. These are institutional racial acts and systems that need to be dealt with. So look, it's an uncomfortable conversation, but it's a conversation that we need to have. And we need to have reasonable people at the table, civil people at the table to engage in the discourse. And we have to have knowledgeable people.
I was going to
So,
ask you about that because
yeah,
we have been hearing people that are trying to have the uncomfortable conversations, but they just don't have the knowledge to go with it. We've heard white blessing, you know, as a replacement for
yeah,
white
yeah.
privilege. We've heard that the forefathers released their slaves as a way to, I don't know, somehow gloss over
And that's not
things.
true. That's not true because think about it. Think about it this way. Again, if you understand slavery as an economic system, the Civil War, all right, did not end that economic system. It simply transformed from guns on a battlefield to policy, to law, such as segregation, such as Jim Crow, which resulted in marginalization, disenfranchisement, and discrimination of Blacks in this country. The first Civil Rights Act was not in 1964, it was 1866, on the heels of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery and the Civil War. But and it actually said that African Americans are now to be treated as full citizens of the United States, afforded full protection of person and property under the law. That's what it said. And that same document excluded Indians.
Mm,
So America, and even freeing one people, still acted racist against another people
yeah.
in this country, in this land that they came into. So that was never enforced because 12 years of Reconstruction showed that once Blacks were allowed to participate fully in the social and political life of American society, they became upwardly mobile. Blacks established their own banks, their own Wall Street, our own hospitals, our own schools, our own businesses, and we saw that kind of progress. But it became a threat. And understand, I understand the South. I understand that when you have an economic system that's based upon a forced labor of slaves, and all of that is taken away from you, that is devastating.
Mm,
And that was the major issue for the South. And they sought to recapture that by other means. So organizations were formed like the Ku Klux Klan and other organizations to make the transition of Africans into American society difficult. I mean,
mm,
vagrancy laws, right? They're now emancipated slaves, right? But they have no jobs. They were not given an economic stimulus to give them a financial jumpstart.
yeah.
So laws were created, all right? So if you weren't working, you were arrested.
Yeah.
And as a result, where did you end up? You ended up in prison. And
Mm,
in prison, what did you become? Forced labor again. Because when you're in prison, you lose your status, your freedom.
yeah.
And now you belong to the state, and the state can use you as it wishes. So look, 1934 to 1968, the Federal Housing Authority, FHA, which was established to bring housing support. You know what it is to have an FHA loan as a first-time home buyer? But from 34 to 1968, it was designed around Jim Crow,
Yeah.
and it was used to redline and to prohibit Blacks from moving into white neighborhoods or even being able to afford their own homes to create and develop their own neighborhoods. Now, there are those who say, well, we had some Black people successful, but that was the exception to the rule.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. So not only did we have institutionalized racism in FHA until 1968,
It's
when
3:30.
a interracial couple had to bring a case, against the United States to dissolve that, but we had the GI Bill. And it's just on and on where we see structural evil, institutionalized racism against a particular people.
Now I'm learning about redlining and all these things that are happening. What can we do as a church to really make sure that we're living up to what the Bible says when all men are created equal? and
Well,
not some economic system.
the church has had its problems historically here in America because the white evangelical America that was part of the establishment of this country. Let me just go back to some history. The 13 colonies were pretty much on the same page. They had a unique balance of the apocalyptic vision, the return of Christ to bring full order to human society, but also an understanding that there was a need for ongoing social reform. That came out of their experience with the British. But when the Civil War was fought, those two things went in separate directions. Political parties followed in different directions. Denominational churches followed in different directions. And the evangelical community that developed out of conservatism and who subscribed to the apocalyptic vision, all right, and rejected progressive social reform, all right, they developed a hermeneutic of segregation that reinforced it in this nation. So if you have a hermeneutic of segregation, it means you have a lens that sees the Bible as God endorsing the separation of races, the subjugation of what you deem inferior people, you see? So the church has to take a look at its hermeneutic. Also, the deficiency in the doctrine of sin. So if you think that sin is only in the individual choices, individual actions, then you'll try to get the person saved and think that, well, that's going to resolve all the problems. But no, sin manifests itself in the individual, but it also manifests societally in societal systems, structures, codes, policy, laws that have to change. So if we don't deal with sin, not only in the individual, but in social systems and structures, all right, then what happens when the person gets saved? Things don't change within that society. Sin is also manifested ecclesially in church structures and systems and theology, and that has to be examined. So a hermeneutic of segregation says God determined this. You take a look at Brown versus the Board of Education and what that did. It resulted in the desegregation of public school systems. What was the response by a lot of the evangelical community, white evangelical community? They created what is called segregated academies. And the government says, that's illegal. You can't do that. So the government threatened, well, we'll take away your 501c3 status. So they transformed them from segregated academies, and not all, but from segregated academy to Christian academies. And these whole Christian academies began to emerge across the country that were rooted in segregation. It was the Catholic Church that said, no, we're going to engage in the desegregation even of our private religious schools. So we've got to look at that history and deal with that history. And unfortunately, there are people who don't want to have that uncomfortable conversation. And there are people who only want to talk to persons of color that they're not nervous around, who feel that they can control or, will be a nice person of color. No, you have to have a straight conversation about all this so we can move.
There are people I've heard they didn't believe that racism still existed because of some of the things that, the laws that had been put in place or had passed. Talk a little bit about practical things. If a white pastor is watching right now and he doesn't want to make the mistake that some of the other pastors made and trying to speak too soon, he wants to do something. He's hearing everything that's being said, but he doesn't know what to do, where to start. He doesn't want to offend a person of color. What would you say to him or her?
Well, look, first of all, I've had white pastors call me, and this is wonderful. They call and they say, AR, I'm feeling the pain. I can't feel it the way you do. I have not walked in the shoes of a person of color, but I can empathize. What can I do? And see, that's what's different today than back in the 60s. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. sat in a jail in Birmingham, and he was working on a letter. He didn't even get to finish it in prison. He finished it after. But in that letter, he was asking the question, where are the Christian churches? Where are the white pastors? Where are the white leaders? That's not the question we're asking today. They're calling, they're saying, we want to get involved. What do we do? And it begins with Proverbs 31, verse 8 through 9 in the New Living Translation. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Ensure justice for those being crushed. Speak up for the poor and helpless and see that they get justice. So you've got a voice, you've got a platform, you've got a sphere of influence. Use that platform, use that voice, use that sphere of influence to speak up on those who are oppressed and marginalized in our society. However, get smart first. Be an informed voice. Don't speak to persons of color paternally, like you're our parent, and now you're going to kind of speak us into quiet submission and understanding and dialogue. No, don't do that. Issue respect, because even that paternalistic attitude comes out of white privilege. The attempt to reorganize, reorder the conversation and change the language comes out of white privilege. You know, and look, I'm happy to have these conversations. I'm not the angry black man, you know, the myth of the angry black man, just like the myth of black inferiority. No, we need to have, excuse me, these conversations, and we need to have them ongoing and not let them rest.
Yeah. You know, for the person of color that keeps hearing phrases like, you need to forgive, or you shouldn't be angry. What do you say to what do you say to people using Bible language like that at the people of color? And then also, what do you say? I would really like both, if you can share to both audiences. What do you say to the person of color that's like, I'm trying to forgive, I'm really angry?
You know, the Holy Spirit is called the Spirit of Truth, right? Let's start right there.
Yes.
Jesus said, when you know the truth is liberating. All truth is confrontational. That's the reality. And truth brings the conviction necessary for change, because we will not change until we're convicted by the truth about who we are, what we're saying, what we're thinking, how we're doing things. Truth is confrontational because it demands that we take the responsibility for our words, thoughts, motives, actions, and our attitudes. So it begins with a conversation around the truth. And we've got enough history here, we've got enough facts to understand the truth that comes out of that history and out of those facts. Forgiveness, gosh, you know, I was in the film Emmanuel 9, which was about the shooting that took place in Emmanuel Church, all right, Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. And you know Dylan Roof, a young white man who came into a Bible study, sat down there for a period of time, and then decided that he wanted to ignite a race war, so he killed 9 people. That was not new. The invasion of sacred spaces was not new. In the 60s, we had 6 churches bombed and burned. In the 90s, we had over 30 churches burned. In an 18-month period from 1995, 1996, we had 30 churches burned. So shooting, burning, bombing of Black churches specifically is not new. The invasion of these sacred spaces is not new. But what was different about Mother Emanuel was not that this young man invaded sacred space with violence. What was different is that when the families of the victims faced this young man with spontaneity, they forgave him one by one by one. I've spoken with the family. They issued forgiveness. Forgiveness is when you surrender the need for revenge and retaliation. Forgiveness reorders the relationship, taking the power away from the perpetrator and giving it back to the victim. Forgiveness releases us from the past. That's what forgiveness is, and we can talk more about it. But forgiveness is not all of a sudden deciding or pretending that you were never hurt, pretending that the past never took place. Forgiveness is not condoning the actions of those who perpetrated a crime against you. Forgiveness is not suddenly trusting that perpetrator. Forgiveness is not relieving the person of their responsibility, because the family made sure they went to court every day to make sure that in spite of that forgiveness that they issued as a gift, that he was going to face the consequences of his actions. So we can get confused when we talk about this word forgiveness, and think that if we do that, we become weak and we let America off the hook. No, it releases us to change the relationship in such a way that we become empowered to have a peer level conversation about where we go from here.
You know, Pastor, I've been hearing from a lot of people that are struggling with even with their Christianity right now. A lot of people of color, my Black friends in particular, who
Why are they struggling?
Multiple things. So I can lay it out. Number one is the idea that they think that the church, the Christian church, has subscribed to racism instead of stand up against it. I've heard this is the religion of the oppressor. Why do I believe this? You know, and for me, my relationship with God has been so experientially, you know, like I can talk about it in that way, but I want to hear from you, because people don't know what to do with their anger. And many times what happens is they tend to turn and run, you know, run sometimes away from their faith and from God.
Well, look, it's not the institution of Christianity that saved me. It's the person of Jesus.
Yes.
So my first response to God's saving grace was to know Jesus. The institution, I'm still trying to figure it out. But the person of Christ has been consistent in the love, the life, and light that has been administered to me in a very deep and profound way. I was born again. So if you understand that, then you'll understand that the history of Christianity is not 400 years old. It's not 600 years. It's 2,000 years old. And there is a clear Christian social ethic that begins with the life and dignity of the human person in the image of God. That the image of God, which is the reason for us to respect one another, that image is conferred. First of all, it's stamped from the moment of conception. So it's an unearned worth. It's an unearned dignity. Has nothing to do with your education, your money, your family name, where you were born, or anything else. Christianity, and only Christianity, hallelujah, presents that foundation of the human person. That's where our social ethic begins. Respect for that dignity. This is why we are the way we are when it comes to the unborn child and the protection of that unborn child, because that child bears the image of God. That is unearned. It is conferred by God. It is a status that's conferred by God upon the human person from the moment of conception. We begin there now. Where is our identity crisis? It's resolved, not in our skin color, not in our wealth, not in our education, but in our reflection of the image of God that's in every human person. So if you're going to say that Christianity is the religion of the oppressor, then you're not reading carefully, because the very book, if it were designed by the oppressor, would oppress everyone but the oppressor. But that book says all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. It says all are in need of salvation. All are in need of redemption. So if I was the oppressor and that was my book, I'm going to say everybody but me needs to be redeemed because I'm superior. But that's not the message of Jesus.
We talked briefly yesterday, and you said, I don't want to just talk about the issue, but talk about the solutions. You shared some already, but I'm telling you right now, there are people that still feel overwhelmed with what to do. And Pastor, the beauty I think that we have here with you and chatting with you is that what I know about you is that you're a man of the Lord. You know, you're a man of God, but you're also a man of wisdom. And sometimes that doesn't come together because people are not seeking God for the other part. But please, can you share spiritually what the church can do right now and practically what the church can do right now?
Well, let's put it in perspective. Proverbs 13:12 says, hope deferred makes the heart sick. That's very important. And the word sick there in the Hebrew, hala, it means not just diseased, but worn out. In other words, having your patience and tolerance exhausted. And that's where persons of color are in this nation. We are suffering from a deferral of hope. Because again and again, just when we think things are going to change, things are going to get better, we see eruptions across the country reminding us that things have not changed the way they need to. I'm not going to cancel out all of the advancements that were achieved by the civil rights movement. But here we are today, dealing with some of the same issues. So that deferral of hope leads to frustration. And frustration is a result of two things: unfulfilled needs and unresolved problems. It's true in any relationship. It's true in a marriage between a husband and wife. It's true in a friendship. It's true in a business. But it's also true in a nation, between that nation and the people who live in that nation, who have had their hopes deferred for hundreds of years. Just when they thought they can participate fully and be respected as a human being, there's incident after incident showing them that that's not true. So this frustration can manifest in an aggression that can lead to violence. It is expressed in the protests, and I do not condone looting, burning, damaging of property, destruction of property. I do not condone that at all, but I understand it. And when I said that, some people said, well, how can you understand it and not condone it? Of course, I understand sin. That doesn't mean I condone sin. There are a lot of things I understand. It doesn't mean I condone them. I understand where people are coming from. And I will say anyone who engages in unlawful activity should experience the consequences of the violation of law. But I understand the frustration. So what do we do? Where do we go from here, right? And we've got to keep the conversation going. So to my white brothers and and sisters, use your voice, use your platform, use your sphere of influence, speak out, but be informed, get smart, talk to someone that knows what they're talking about, read, understand the history, and don't come from a place of white privilege. I see some white pastors convening conversations. And I asked, well, where do they get the qualifications to have that conversation? And then what comes out in the conversation shows that they weren't qualified to have that conversation. And that leads back to white privilege. Like, I can have this conversation. No, I think that we need to learn to listen, to be quiet, to listen and learn at this period. Know what you're talking about. Prayer. Look, evil traffics in deceit, injustice, and chaos. We have to pray that truth, justice, and order prevail. We understand, those of us who understand the book and understand our Christianity and understand spirituality, we know that there are principalities and powers at work in this world that are influencing, informing, and shaping people and institutions and governments towards deceit, towards chaos, towards injustice. Prayer is powerful in that prayer changes atmospheres. And we must never, never underestimate the power of an atmosphere, because an atmosphere creates the environment for miracles to take place. So pray, and don't minimize prayer because you feel that you want to get out there and protest and someone says, I'm called to pray. Don't minimize that. Don't diminish that. That's important. Prayer, advocacy. There are policies, there are systems that are in place, there are legal codes that are in place that reinforce discrimination, marginalization, disenfranchisement. Advocate against those policies and advocate for policies that bring equity, that bring justice, that remove discrimination, marginalization, and disenfranchisement. There is activism, and that's where you become vocal. You got a voice, you become vocal to the disruption of the status quo. Because unless the status quo becomes so untenable, so inconvenient, people will not look to change. So the status quo has to become so untenable, so inconvenient that change is the only alternative. Activism engages, it gets out there to change that status quo. Maybe you're called to protest. That's where you have the gift to organize, to gather people around an issue and coordinate acts of civil gathering and even civil disobedience, where peaceful, nonviolent action is taken to express your pushback against social systems and structures, their inequities, their deficiencies, especially as it relates to particular people, minorities. Maybe you're called to convene. Maybe you have a platform that you can invite other voices in to speak to the issue, informed voices to speak to the issue. Maybe you're willing to lend your platform to the conversation. So convening and development, replacing those broken systems, replacing those codes, those structures, bringing equity, economic development. You have the power. I was on a call with JP Morgan Chase and their executives, and they're asking, what can we do? How can we get involved in this conversation? You have to know your lane too. Not everybody is called to all of this. Maybe one person's called to prayer, another to development, another to advocacy. Know your lane. Be qualified for that lane. Understand if your gift, talents, and abilities bring you there, and then go for it.
Oh man, thank you so much. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's such a wealth of knowledge and we need it so much. And I'm just so grateful for you to lend your time to us during this. I know that there's so many people that are looking to you for guidance right now, and I'm so grateful that we can help our audience be educated, learn, and give them tools to know what to do moving forward. Thank you so much, Pastor Bernard.
Well, let me say thank you to the Christian Post for allowing this conversation, and hopefully we can have more conversations and keep the conversations going. So, God bless you for what you're doing. Thank you, dear.